Thank you, and hello everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Nathalie, and we're going to spend the next 25 minutes looking at something I reckon a lot of us have been thinking about. How can we use policy attention to understand and demonstrate research impact? So I'm going to walk you through some real examples from real users so you can see how this plays out in practice. So that's what we're going to cover for today. We're going to start with the concept of research impact, just because the word gets used in a lot of different ways, but not everyone's asking the same question. Then we'll talk about research reaching policy, and more often than we assume, and how it leaves a trail and where a tool like Overton fits into the picture. From there, we'll get concrete, looking at the policy footprint of a researcher, and we'll finish with a brief look at building a broader policy narrative at the university level this time. So let's get into it. So what do we mean by impact? So this slide is based on a 2025 paper by Williams and colleagues, published in Research Evaluation. So the question was simple. When countries use similar frameworks to evaluate research impact, do researchers end up describing that impact in the same way? So to find out, they looked at over 7,000 impact case studies from Australia, Hong Kong, and the UK. And what they found is that even though the frameworks look very similar on paper, the way researchers describe and justify their impact differs a lot depending on where they are. So the paper's explanation is that each culture has its own toolkit of language and ways of thinking. And that toolkit shapes how people in that context talk about impact. So here are the two main findings. The first is that official definitions of impact across these three frameworks are almost identical. All three described impact as an effect beyond academia, in areas like the economy, society, health, and so on. So the paper calls this convergence. Same idea, same words, same template. The second finding shows that despite sharing those definitions, these three countries tell very different stories. UK impact case studies tend to be strategic and wide-ranging. In Hong Kong, economic outcomes and policy influence dominate. And in Australia, there is a stronger focus on practical applications and community engagement. So these are for three countries only, and there are many more. And we will be sending a resource along the recording, including more countries and if they evaluate impact retrospectively or prospectively. But the main takeaway here is that depending on where your researchers are applying for funding, their research impact might get assessed differently depending on its cultural context. So something which remains common in between these frameworks is that policy influence often counts as an interesting and valid milestone of potential research impact. But policy documents, are scattered across thousands of sources, and most researchers simply do not monitor them. Very often, most academics don't find out their work reached policy until someone tells them. So that gap is exactly where some of you may come in, because researchers do the work and you're the ones who help make it visible, shareable, and useful to the people who need it. So for the rest of today, we're going to focus specifically on policy attention as one route into demonstrating impact. Not because it's the only one, it isn't, but because it's one where the evidence is increasingly there to find. So let's think about why policy attention matters before we get into the how. So many of you have probably heard about Mark Reed from Fast Track Impact. So Mark puts it bluntly in his book. He says, there is no such thing as evidence-based policy. Instead, there is evidence-informed policy only. So basically, it's saying that policymakers don't simply follow the evidence. Instead, they weigh it against their ongoing priorities, their budgets, their political agendas. This means that if you want to influence policy, you can't just produce excellent research and expect the policy world to find it. You also need to understand how the policy world works, where it looks for evidence, and what form policymakers need that evidence to take. So one way I found useful to think about this is by using the Research Impact Academy logic model. So it explains how impact actually happens rather than something that appears fully formed from a research paper. So instead, it travels through a chain. So on the left side of the slide, you start with your inputs like your time, funding, expertise. And then the next stage focuses on the outputs you produce, like peer-reviewed publications, reports, datasets, exhibitions. In the middle stage is your reach. Who actually encountered your outputs? And this is where policy attention sits. It can tell you which policy documents picked up your work, in which countries, in which policy areas. The following stage is the outcomes. Did anything change in policy as a result? And finally, the impact, which is the lasting change in the world, in society. So the important thing to remember is that each stage is necessary, but not sufficient in itself. You can have fantastic outputs, but no reach. You can have reach, but no outcomes. So the chain has to hold together. Coming back on the reach stage, Overton can show you where your research traveled after it left the journal. Overton brings together millions of documents published by governments, think tanks, NGOs, and other policy organizations, and it links them to the research and evidence they referenced. So it tells you whether research was picked up and whether someone writing a policy document thought it was worth citing, and you can also explore how policymakers use evidence. So for researchers, universities, and funders, it bridges the gap between academic work and real-world decision, making it easier to show that research shapes policy and not just in theory. So in this study from 2025, Malecki and colleagues looked at over 150,000 Ref 2021 journal articles. And they found that research rarely goes straight from a journal to a government department. Instead, it travels through intermediaries like NGOs, charities, think tanks, regulatory bodies, and NGOs. So Overton also indexes all of those policy documents. It doesn't index government documents only, because if you only search government sources, you're only seeing the last stop on the journey. Overton is built to show you the whole route. So Malecki's study also mapped the policy cycle into 5 stages, as shown on this graph. You've got the agenda setting, formulation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation. And it found that most research, the blue bars on the graph, get cited during the formulation stage. That's when policymakers are actively drafting and shaping a policy. It's the moment they're looking for evidence. But obviously, different types of research are useful at different points in policy. For instance, early exploratory work tends to shape how a problem gets defined, while applied research gets picked up more when a policy is being written. So for you as impact specialist, this changes the conversation you can have with your academics. So instead of asking, have you had any policy reach? You can ask, Where are you in this cycle? And is that helping you discover who you should be engaging with? So thinking of audiences, I found this other work from RIA insightful. It shows that research users within the policy sphere is a much broader group than most of us imagine. They group it into 4 different types. You've got the decision makers, regulators and public bodies, practitioners, and society and advocacy groups. Each group needs something different. For instance, an OECD analyst needs something that travels across contexts, while a parliamentary advisor needs something quotable. And this matters because the same research needs to be communicated differently depending on who you're trying to reach. So let's get concrete now and look at what this looks like at the level of an individual researcher. So for this, we're going to take the example of Sonia's Livingstone as a case study. So Sonia is a professor of social psychology at the London School of Economics, and she has spent 30 years researching how digital technology shapes children's lives. So her work covers a lot of ground. She's been involved into large EU projects. She's published books, peer-reviewed articles, policy reports, so that gives us plenty to work with in Overton. So we'll look first at a policy reach and then think about how to present the same data depending on who you're talking to. So if we go back briefly to the model we were looking at before, this is what her research would look like. So her inputs on the left are what you'd expect. You've got decades of expertise, strong institutional backing from LSE, and funding from sources including the European Commission and UKRI. Her outputs are diverse. So she's authored over 400 publications, but also policy briefings, public resources for parents and educators, and she's been giving expert evidence to parliamentary committees. Then there's Rich, and this is where Overton comes in. So Overton highlights that her research has been cited in policy documents across more than 40 countries, as well as in parliamentary debates, national strategies on child online safety, and international guidance documents. The outcomes are concrete. Specific policies and pieces of legislation cite her work as part of their evidence base, like the Online Safety Act in 2023. And for the impact part, her work has fed directly into some of the biggest policy debates of the last decade, and not just in the UK, but all around the world. So that's the overall picture. It's also possible to analyze policy reach at a more granular level, which is what I'm going to show now. And here what I've done is I've singled out one article from Sonia published in 2023. And we can see that Overton can also help you track how research spreads across policy. So what's striking about this network here is the breadth. So this single scholarly article has not been cited by UK policy only. And the UK ones are showing up in blue on this network. But the article also got cited by government documents from other countries she may never have directly engaged with, and they're showing up in green. We can see how research evidence is traveling through branches and intermediaries and being picked up by the different types of policy organization, each representing a different route into the policy world. So we can say that Overton signals reach in policy, bearing in mind that reach is not quite the same as significance. And that's really well explained in this 2025 blog post from Tamsin Varney, linked at the bottom of this slide. So reach is about breadth, providing the numbers and the context, while significance is about depth. Significance can show if the evidence has changed anything, if there's been a shift in policy. By analyzing Sonia's reach in policy, we can uncover that some of her research got cited in the evidence assessment preceding the Online Safety Act, and that's significance. So now for the next few slides, we're going to look at how to tailor and highlight the same underlying evidence, but for different audiences. So let's start with a researcher's own webpage, which is probably one of the most public-facing thing a researcher has. So the audience here can be quite broad. It can be students, journalists, the general public, potential collaborators. So they're not experts in the field and they won't read a technical argument. They want to understand why your work matters, so the writing has to work differently. So the checklist you see on the left is really about moving from CV mode to impact mode. So if we use Sonia's example, we aren't listing her outputs, we're showing where the work went, laws being passed, rights being protected. And this is where Overton data earns its place. It's real number, real organizations, real legislation. That's what makes it credible rather than just promotional. Now let's look at writing up for a grant application. So if you're helping your academics with funding applications, grant reviewers are very different audience. These are peers who know the field and they're making a judgment call. Is this researcher likely to deliver significant research? So for them, Overton data can be used much more directly to demonstrate demand for this type of evidence. So on this slide, I've put two examples for two funders just to show how requirements can differ from one to the next. So for UKRI, impact is woven through the entire vision and approach document. That actually gives you more room because you can include data points collected in Overton within the vision section, which requires you to name your specific beneficiaries, within the approach section to show it's not just an afterthought, and within the team capability section where you evidence your policy engagement. While if you look at ERC in the green box on the top right corner of the slide, it's very different. It doesn't include an impact section. Instead, evidence policy engagement needs to be submitted in the track record. And now let's look at writing up for a parliamentary audience. So parliamentary people are busy people and they're focused on decisions, not research quality. They want to know one thing: is this useful to me right now? So you lead with relevance, not credentials, not this is excellent research, but this speaks directly to the question your committee is looking at. Then you give the finding in one sentence and you offer something concrete like a written briefing. So Overton data plays a specific role here. It establishes credibility and reach because it tells the parliamentary reader that other parts of the policy world have already found this work relevant. And now to finish, we're going to scale this up and briefly look at what this looks like for a university. So this is where things get actually strategic and where Overton's value is perhaps overlooked. So we can see here that it's possible to take the same approach, but looking at the evidence at a different level. While a researcher may ask, is my work reaching the right people in policy? A university asks, where are we influential in policy? And does that match what we say we stand for? So these aren't just impact questions. They are directly connected to things your university already cares about, like your reputation, your financial stability, and positioning yourself strategically to attract partnership and understand where you've got room to grow. So to get started on this, I'd suggest a couple of concrete questions like, where are we strong? It tells you what's working. And also, where do we want to be? So given your university strategy, the missions and priorities you're committed to, are you showing up in the policy debates that matter for these missions? So that's a strategic question. It tells you where there might be a gap between aspiration and visibility. So I'm going to take a quick example for, I'll be using Edinburgh University just to investigate quickly what we can pull out. So to the question, where have we reached in policy? We can see that Edinburgh policy footprint is substantial. So if we look at policy documents published over the last 5 years, we can see that we've got more than 15,000 citing policy documents that have cited their research, and they're coming from 106 countries and thousands of different policy sources. But if you pick it, if you notice, it's not just a UK story. Yes, UK sources are strong, but the IG block showing up in green is actually the largest single category, meaning bodies like WHO, the United Nations, or the World Bank are citing Edinburgh's research more than any single country. So that's quite a powerful message for universities thinking about global influence. But one other thing that often gets overlooked in this kind of analysis is the local dimension. And the good news is that Overton indexes local sources too, like the Scottish government documents or Scottish Parliament committee reports and public body guidance. And these corpus of documents show a distinct picture of Edinburgh's local influence. So for many research areas like housing, social policy, education, or health, this is significant because devolution means that Scottish policy is the most immediate policy context. So for a researcher from Edinburgh whose work influences Scottish government's guidance, it is having, real impact, even if it doesn't show up in Westminster policy documents. So when you're analyzing the data, make sure you're also looking at the scope, geographic scope for the question you're asking, because global reach is impressive, but sometimes local influence can carry more weight. And just to wrap up, so just wanted again to flag up that impact specialists and librarians understand why capturing policy reach early matters, but sometimes helping others see that can be difficult. But one thing to take away from today is to ask yourself, would your researchers know if their work had reached policy, at which stage, and could they prove it? And when you ask this, one of two things happen. Either they say yes, and you've got a story worth capturing and building on, or they say no. And that's also an opportunity because you can then start setting up a search in Overton, start tracking prospectively, and to make sure the next piece of work leaves a clearer trail. So either way, it opens up a door. So I'll stop now and I'll take any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. I'll just pop in here with some of the questions that are in the chat. So the first question is, does Overton's interface have a Sankey option to track influence throughout all the stages, or was what Natalie just showed built separately using Overton data?
At the moment, the paper that I've shown from 2025 showing the 5 stages within policy is something that I wanted to demonstrate for this webinar, but it's not something that is implemented or embedded within the product.
Okay, the next one is, how did you create the image on the slide? Overton can also demonstrate reach throughout policy.
Just let me... It's not the logic model, is it? This one?
I think it's this one.
Yes. So I've created actually the networks going through the explore function of Overton and building it up step by step. So you can see here you've got level 0, then you've got level 1, level 2, level 3. And every time I was exploring the network to create that graph.
So kind of similar to that question, the network figure was generated for a single paper only. How can you summarize that same kind of information for someone's whole publication record for use in, say, like a funding application?
At the moment, it will be through like manual processes, or you can do it using the tool, but it will be like a manual process. We are working also on some enhancements where you can do that. It's something that is not available yet, but we're hoping to have it either later this year or in 2027.
Great. Next one is, does Overton have any functionality to help us understand the significance of impact, not just the reach? For example, did anything change?
Again, that's another area we're really interested, and we're investigating ways to get this done within the tool. And yes, so that's definitely something we're keen on exploring. We know the value and we would be interested in doing that. I can't give you any details now on how we would do that, but yeah, it's hopefully on the roadmap.
Okay. And then the final question in the chat is it more common that policymakers cite studies that reinforce their beliefs? What does happen to evidence that contradicts their thinking? So it's a bit of that's a big one.
I think for that one, what we can do as well when we send the email tomorrow is we can point as well to the Overton Data and Research section. Within that section, you'll have specific articles who have been looking at this specifically. So there's an example, for instance, of a paper, I think either published this year or last year, I can't remember, from Alex Furness, looking at bipartisan policy documents. So you could see how it plays out depending on which political parties you're from. So some of our users have been doing some research on this, and we've got it available on our website. So for the moment, I would point to that.
Thanks. And I can see that one person has their hand raised, so I'm just going to allow them to speak so they can ask their question. Liz, Maria, I think if you have a question, you're...
Hi, it was a mistake. I just sent the last question and thank you for the answering.
I think that covered all the questions in the chat. So I guess if anyone else has any other questions.
Okay. So like Laura explained at the beginning, we'll be sending the slides, the recording, and some resources very soon. And we can also include like Overton Data and Research. I think it would be valuable for if you want to explore all the research publications that have used Overton as one of their data source. But thank you very much for joining us today, and see you again soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.